Hi guys, welcome to our first presentation for Unit 3 Sociology, Area of Study 1, which is Australian Indigenous Culture. So in this presentation we'll be looking at a bit of an introduction to culture, what its meaning is, and particularly the two major components of culture being material and non-material culture. Okay, let's get into it. The first thing you need to be able to do is define culture. What is culture? We talk about it all the time. We talk about my culture, our culture, your culture, their culture, our shared culture. We need to have a good understanding in sociology of what we mean when we say that. So, in sociology, and this is a really important point for you to have down in your notebooks, culture is a central concept. So we define culture as the way of life, shared values, norms, and everyday practices that are characteristic of a particular group or society. Okay, so culture, a whole group of things makes up a society or a group's culture. But the important word in that definition, I think, is characteristic of. So these are a unique group of things that kind of together belong only to that group. So culture isn't necessarily something that you are born with just by virtue of being a member of a particular group. Culture is learnt by the members of a group or society, and it's passed down the generations. And we learn the norms of a culture, of the cultural cultures that we might be a part of, through socialization. Okay? So two important things there, the definition of culture and the fact that it is learnt and passed down, that we are socialised within a culture. It still makes culture a really big term. All of these things that you can see around the word culture here all make up elements of our culture. So when I say that culture isn't necessarily something you're born knowing, it's something that you learn and are taught. Let's look at something individual like, for example, food. Now, if you're born into a particular culture, you may learn through socialization the particular foods that are associated with that culture. You will learn them indirectly by eating those foods, by having those foods at special occasions, by eating particular types of foods that might be associated with celebrations, by cooking, and even by being explicitly taught recipes, by your parents or grandparents. That's an example of those things being taught. Gender roles, for example, while these may not be explicitly taught, you will certainly be socialised to act in a particular way based on cultural expectations because of what you see. What kinds of things did the boys do at home in your culture? What kinds of things did the girls do? What expectations were placed on boys and girls at particular ages or in particular contexts? So the important point there is that culture is taught. Another thing to note is that culture can change. Culture isn't some fixed thing in a particular group or society. You can see here in the images, this is an example of dress in Australian culture, or kind of white Australian, European influenced culture. What started, perhaps at the turn of the century as, women wearing long, heavy dresses, hats, high collars, being very covered up, moved through, the 20th century and into the 21st century to look completely different. Dress is still an aspect of culture, but what dress looks like in 2020 looks very different to the way that dress looked in 1950 and, the late 1800s. So culture can change over time. Okay, so we've got a basic understanding of what culture is. We know that it can change over time, and we know that it's learned through socialisation. Next two things that you need to understand as part of this unit, and you should have definitions written down in your book for these, is the concept of material and non-material culture. So at the most basic level, the easiest way you can remember this is thoughts and things. So material culture is things and non-material culture is thoughts. So when we look at material culture, these are all the physical objects and things. So, these are things that you can see that are created by members that are used to attach meaning to their culture. So this is everything like art, clothing, food, buildings, tools, flora and fauna. Okay, um, you know, uh, lots of things that you could go and see, or you could visit in a museum, or that um, could be handed down to you from your grandparents, for example. Then we've got non material culture, and these are ideas rather than physical objects. So, non material culture provides a guide for viewing the world and how to behave within it. So, non material culture includes beliefs, values, rules, norms, morals, language, and knowledge. So, for example, if you belong to a group um, where there was an expectation that women were to stay home, that was, a value or a norm, then that would be a component of non material culture. If in that same culture um, women were expected to wear a certain style of dress, that would be an aspect of material culture. Okay? Thoughts and things. So we know that there are two components of culture. It can be difficult because sometimes they overlap and they're really interrelated. So I've got a picture here of the Australian flag as an example. So I've said often a thing, so material culture, can be a physical expression of a thought, non-material culture. So the Australian flag here is a component of material culture for Australians. It's a physical thing. It's an image or it's a physical object. So it's an object of material culture. But it's also an expression of a thought or thoughts. So in this case, we've got the Union Jack, and that expresses our shared history with Britain. We've got the Southern Cross, which is a representation of our geographical location. So there are thoughts embedded within the thing. So material and non-material culture are mostly separate, but be careful because sometimes things can be physical expressions of thoughts. Okay, if we want to take it a little bit further. We'll do an activity on that in class so you can get your head around material and non-material aspects of Australian culture. So because this unit is Australian Indigenous culture, let's look at a couple of examples that are specific to Aboriginal culture in Australia. So we'll start with non-material culture. We're going to look at kinship law. So like it says, in Aboriginal culture, kinship law is a complex system that governs family relationships and social organisation. Kinship law determines how Aboriginal people relate to one another and their roles and responsibilities. So this sounds fairly straightforward, but it's actually very complex and in-depth, and can vary from one Aboriginal nation to another. But as an example, so it includes the practice of avoidance relationships, such as between a mother-in-law and son-in-law, which requires a social distance. If avoidance relationships were practiced, these two may not be able to be in the same room or car. So that's a non-material element of their culture. So as part of Aboriginal kinship law, if avoidance relationships are practiced, their culture says, oh gosh, okay, if there's a man and his mother-in-law is, in the same room, one of them may need to leave the room in order to, keep up that cultural requirement of kinship law. So that's an example from Aboriginal culture. To take the idea of kinship law further, or to give you another example, is the totem system. So again, this varies between nations, but broadly speaking, every Aboriginal person is given a number of totems, and they link a person to the physical universe, to land, water, geographical features, and animals. So as part of this idea of totems, individuals are accountable to their totems and must ensure these totems are protected and passed on to future generations. Have a look at this quote at the bottom, which I think explains this cultural aspect really well. So, this is an Aboriginal person who said, "Having a totem is much deeper. It's about looking after everything. Everything that's associated with the animal, like the yellow belly, I have to look after. The fish, the water, the reeds, everything to do with that fish." So that's from someone whose totem is the yellow belly, and he's explaining how the responsibilities that come with it. I won't go into this in detail, but there's a whole heap of terms that go along with Aboriginal kinship law. It's not necessary information, but you may wish to have a look because it certainly differs from cultures that you might belong to. So, kinship law and totems, we had those as an example of non-material culture. Obviously, there's plenty more. There's also plenty of material culture examples. Just one is something I thought was pretty cool. It's carved emu eggs. So this is practiced in Carnarvon in WA and also in parts of southeastern Australia. And Aboriginal people have these carved emu eggs, and they literally scratch away at the outside of a large emu egg. And as you scratch away, you get different layers of colour from this dark kind of charcoal black right through to white. And they carve away at it to create these pictures and scenes. And the eggs, as they say, provide a rich visual history of Aboriginal culture and reinforce connections to animals, especially the emu and the land. So this is another example of material culture reflecting non-material culture. So the material culture is the egg itself. It's a thing. It's a thing that can be viewed in a museum to be passed on down, between the generations. But it also reflects thoughts. It reflects their values of, valuing the land, of being connected to animals, and of telling stories and of kind of keeping their oral history alive. Okay, that's it for the talking bit. We will do these exam style questions in class. So all of these you should now be able to answer. If we go back to our learning intention at the very start. So we wanted to be able to define the term culture. We have a definition now. Give examples of aspects of a culture that I belong to. We'll do that with the in-class task. Explain the difference between material and non-material culture. You can certainly do that, remembering thoughts and things. And give examples of non-material and material culture, and you can do that with the Aboriginal cultural elements that we looked at, so the emu eggs and kinship laws, avoidance relationships and totems. Okay, hope that helps. See you next lesson.